Hey everyone, today we're going to look at setting up your Synology NAS to back up to a Raspberry Pi using Hyper Backup. Now the tutorial is broken up into two sections. The first is going to show you how to do it on-site and the second will show you how to do it off-site. When I say on-site, I pretty much just mean that you plan on keeping your Raspberry Pi at your house and it'll be attached to your local network. If you plan on keeping this at a friend or family member's house, you'll have to do a few additional steps to ensure you can actually VPN back to your home network. So before we get started, I just want to say that there are written instructions in the description. There's a lot of steps for this, and I just want to make sure that you follow along with that. Since there's so many commands, it's easier to just ensure you know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. There are also two prerequisites that I want to point out. So you need to ensure that you're able to SSH into your Raspberry Pi. And if you'll be completing the second portion of this tutorial for offsite backups, you need to be able to assign a static IP address to your clients that are connecting to your VPN server. Now I created a video on this for the Synology VPN server and I will link that in the description. So this step isn't necessary, but it makes everything a lot easier because you'll always know what IP address you're connecting from. Now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting up our Raspberry Pi as an Rsync server. Now configuring it this way will actually allow Hyper Backup to see it and actually back up to it. Now there's a lot of commands that we're going to be running, but in the beginning we're just going to format the external hard drive that we have and we're going to make a file system off of it. Now it's a good idea if you have an external hard drive that actually has its own power supply. And the main reason for that is because you don't really want to have to rely on the Raspberry Pi to actually power this hard drive if you don't have to. But that's really just a recommendation. So after we actually formatted the hard drive and we made the file system, we're going to create a directory and we're just going to mount that directory every single time the system boots. And this is going to be our Hyper Backup destination. So this is going to be where our files are actually stored. So after the backup directory is created, we're actually going to enable the Rsync server and we're going to create a configuration file in our home directory. Now this process is actually different than if you were setting up an Rsync server traditionally. So when you set up an Rsync server traditionally, you're actually setting up an Rsync user and password. In this case, we're actually using our Raspberry Pi's default username and password, and we're storing the configuration file in the actual home directory. So we're doing it this way because this actually allows us to utilize SSH, which pretty much ensures that our traffic from our Synology NAS to our Raspberry Pi is encrypted. So now that the Rsync server is enabled and the configuration file is created in the home directory, the process is actually complete at this point. So we can actually sign into DSM and create a new backup job in Hyper Backup. At the backup destination settings section, I just want to point out a few things. So the server name or IP address, that's obviously going to be your local IP address for your Raspberry Pi. Now you want to make sure that you have encryption on and the port set as 22. So for the username and password, this is where you're going to actually enter the Raspberry Pi's username and password that you use to normally log in. This is not an Rsync username and password. But when you do that, you should see in the backup module section the Hyper Backup destination that we actually created. And at that point, you'll see the directory which will be automatically filled out. Now the directory is just the file name of the Hyper Backup file that's created. So Hyper Backup creates a HBK file and the directory is just the file name that it will use. Now as you navigate through this, you'll be able to select the folders that you want to back up and the applications that you want to back up. But when you get to the final section, this is where I want to point out a few things. If you plan on keeping your Raspberry Pi on, it's probably a good idea to have a backup schedule enabled as well as an integrity check enabled. And you can set this up daily, weekly, whatever you want it to be. But the biggest thing I want to point out here is the client-side encryption. Now, client-side encryption just encrypts the backup file that's actually created. So with encryption enabled, you would need the password that you created to actually open that HBK file. So if for some reason your external hard drive is stolen and somebody connects it to a Synology NAS and tries to restore it, they would still need that password or the file that it actually creates when you create encryption to open that backup file. Now on my production server, I do have this enabled, and I have it enabled because I'm using this as an offsite backup. But if this was something that I just was keeping at the house kind of as a second backup, I'm not sure I'd enable it. I'm not enabling it in this tutorial, but it's really personal preference and however you'd like it set up. After you finish setting everything up, you're actually going to be at a stage where you can back up to this Raspberry Pi now. but you might receive an error. And I'm highlighting this because I've created a few of these now and it seems totally random, but sometimes the folder permissions aren't actually applied properly. So what I do is I go into the Raspberry Pi and I actually set myself as the root user and I redo the permissions to ensure that everybody has read-write permissions on the mounted folder. If you did receive an error at this stage, that's the reason why, and you have to go back and redo those permissions. If everything did work properly, the backup is actually fully configured now. So it's probably a good idea to actually do a full backup at this point, because even if you do intend on using this as an offsite backup, the local backup will go much quicker. So you can technically do a local backup and then move it offsite, and you'll just be doing incremental backups at that point. Now the second section that we're going to go over is actually configuring OpenVPN to start on boot. So I have the VPN server set up on my NAS, and I actually configured my users to have static IP addresses. Now I already did a video on this, but I'm going to link it in the description in case you want to learn how. And I have a specific username that I use only for this process that has a static IP address. I want to highlight that this absolutely is not mandatory and you don't have to do it, but I find it easier because at this point, all I have to do is turn on my Raspberry Pi, it will connect back to my home network using my VPN, and my Hyper Backup is actually configured to look for that IP address. So everything is kind of set up as is, all I have to do is turn it on. But for the actual OpenVPN setup, the process is pretty simple. So we install it and then copy over our configuration file. And at that point, we have to put it in a specific directory, which is read every time the Raspberry Pi is booted. So this is pretty much what actually allows the Raspberry Pi to automatically connect to the VPN as soon as it's booted up. Once all of that is configured, we have to create a secrets file, and that's just our VPN user credentials. And then we permission that out so that nobody can access that file. The final step is to force OpenVPN to start on boot, and that's it. If you reboot now, your Raspberry Pi will actually try and connect to your VPN. So if you do want to test it, you have to connect to an external network. So for me, the easiest thing is to actually connect to my cell phone's hotspot. So I turn it on, connect to it, and ensure that my VPN is working properly. So if you get to this stage, you're technically complete. So that means that you set up the Rsync server and you set up your VPN provider to start up on your Raspberry Pi's boot. But there's one very important step that we still need to do. So since your local network and your VPN network are on different subnets, we have to ensure that they can talk to each other. So to do that, we have to create a static route. But unfortunately, this has to be done in the router, and everybody's routers are different. So I'm going to put up a screenshot that shows how mine is set up, but you're going to have to look through this yourself. As soon as you set this up, you need to restart your VPN server, and you have to do this so that it can pick up the new static route. But as soon as you do, you should see that you can ping your VPN subnet from your local network subnet. And if you do that, you'll be able to see that subnet from your Hyper Backup. So you can then go into Hyper Backup and change the local IP address for your Raspberry Pi to the IP address of your Raspberry Pi when you're utilizing the VPN. So the tutorial is now complete, but I want to give a quick backstory on why I did this. So I have a lot of data that's very important to me that gets backed up online every night. But I also have a lot of media files and other files that are important to me, but not important enough to pay the online fees that some of these providers charge. So my thought process was, if I could figure out how to utilize a Raspberry Pi and use an external hard drive, I'd be able to have an offsite backup where I purchase the equipment once and don't have to pay any recurring fees. So that was one benefit, but there's also the huge benefit of performance. So since I'm able to back this up locally, it goes significantly quicker than it would if I had to back it up to an online provider. And at that point, I can then transport it to a family member's house, leave it there, and only do incremental backups. So I knew right off the bat that backing it up would go significantly quicker than using one of these online providers. But I was also thinking from a catastrophic standpoint that if I did lose all of my data, the quickest way for me to restore it would be to actually have the hard drive. So I know that a lot of these cloud storage providers do offer hard drives that you can purchase and restore your data and ship back, but they normally come with a charge. And when you start to think of everything, you can pretty much have the exact same setup where you have to pay a little bit more upfront, but don't have any recurring charges, and you'll be able to get your data pretty quickly if you had to. So I really believe that this is a great way to back up data that's important, but not necessarily important enough to pay the cloud storage fees. So once again, everything that we went over today is in the written instructions in the description. And if you plan on doing this, you should really check them out because it'll guide you through the process step by step, and you'll be able to understand a little better why we're doing things the way that we're doing them. Because it is somewhat different than setting up an Rsync server on a regular Raspberry Pi. You're kind of setting it up in a way that it will interact with your Synology NAS and in specific Hyper Backup. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments either on YouTube or on the website where the written instructions are, and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you found the content helpful, please like the video and subscribe. It really helps me out, and thank you for watching.